The sun was setting low across the wide-open sky, painting the horizon with shades of orange and gold. It was the kind of evening where the land seemed endless, quiet except for the rustle of grass in the breeze and the distant call of a hawk. Out here, life was still lived the old way, simple, rugged, and bound by a deep respect for the land and the people who called it home. But on this particular day, that quiet calm was about to be broken by something extraordinary. It wasn't the sound of cattle, nor the sudden crack of thunder. It was the echo of hooves, many of them moving as one. A line of riders appeared in the distance, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. 50 warriors, proud and united, were making their way to a lone rancher's land. They weren't coming to challenge him. They weren't coming to take anything. They were coming to honor him. The story begins with the cowboy, the kind of man who lived by grit, instinct, and the unspoken code of the West. He wasn't famous, and he didn't chase recognition. His days were filled with long rides across the range, fixing fences, herding cattle, and caring for the land that gave him his living. To most people, he was just another rancher, another weathered hat under the big sky. But one moment changed everything. One act of courage, in the face of real danger, would ripple far beyond his ranch and reach into the heart of a community that still carried deep traditions and respect for bravery. It happened on an afternoon when the air was dry, and the mountains seemed closer than usual, their jagged peaks catching the sunlight. The cowboy had been out riding, keeping an eye on his herd, when he noticed something unusual. At first it was only a sound, a low, guttural growl rolling through the rocks above. His horse shifted nervously, ears flicking toward the ridge. That's when he saw it, a mountain lion, muscles coiled, eyes locked on its prey. But what stopped him cold wasn't the predator itself. It was who the animal was stalking. On the narrow trail below the ridge walked an elder, a native man moving carefully with the weight of years. His steps were steady but slow, and he didn't yet realize the danger waiting above him. In that instant, the cowboy didn't hesitate. Something inside him knew there wasn't time to think or call out. He had to act. With a kick of his boots, he urged his horse forward, closing the distance between predator and prey. The mountain lion's body tensed, ready to spring, but the cowboy's charge startled it just long enough to shift its focus. What followed was a blur of instinct, a clash between man, horse, and wild beast, where every second could have meant the difference between life and death. When the dust settled, the elder stood alive, untouched. The cowboy, breathing hard, had placed himself squarely in the path of danger and driven the predator back into the wild. There were no crowds to cheer, no cameras to capture the moment. It was just two men, one who had faced danger and one who had been spared from it. The elder's eyes held a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something that spoke of bonds older than words. He said little, but the look he gave was a promise that this act would not be forgotten. Days passed, and the cowboy returned to his work, thinking little of what he had done. To him, it was just the right thing, the only thing. But word began to spread, quietly at first, carried from one voice to another among the community the elder belonged to. They spoke of the rancher who had stood between a predator and one of their own, who had acted without thought for himself, and in their traditions, acts of courage held a weight that could not be measured by money or fame. It was about honor, respect, and the sacred duty of protecting life. So when the sound of hooves rose on that golden evening, the cowboy had no idea what was coming. He stepped out from his barn, wiping the dust from his hands, when he saw them approaching. 50 riders, moving as one, their horses strong, their presence commanding. They did not come in silence. Their arrival carried the weight of tradition, of ceremony, of something far larger than one man. The cowboy's heart beat faster as they circled his land, their faces proud, their eyes fixed on him. In that moment, the quiet rancher realized he was at the center of something rare, something almost forgotten in the modern world. These warriors had not come for conflict. They had come to honor, to give respect where it was due, to surround the man who had risked his life for their elder, and to show in the old ways that courage does not go unnoticed. The air was heavy with meaning, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. And there he stood, one man against the backdrop of the wide-open West, 50 warriors surrounding him in tribute. The cowboy's weathered hat shielded his eyes, but he could feel the weight of their gaze. He didn't know what they would do next. Would they speak? Would they perform a ritual? Would they leave him with a gift or a burden he hadn't expected? The moment stretched out, charged with tension, caught between the past and the present. The sun slipped lower, shadows growing long across the land, and the rancher knew life would never be the same after this night. Because sometimes a single act of courage doesn't just save a life, it changes the way history remembers you. The question was, what would come next? What did this gathering of riders mean, and how would it shape the path of a cowboy who never asked for recognition, but found himself honored in the most powerful way imaginable? That answer, however, was still to come. For now, all he could do was stand tall, surrounded, waiting for the moment when silence would break and the story would unfold in a way that no one watching, not even he, would ever forget. The rancher stood frozen in the fading light, the soft creak of saddle leather filling the silence as the warriors reined in their horses. 50 riders circled the dusty yard, their presence heavy with meaning. Dust lifted around their horses' hooves, catching in the last glow of the sun. It was not a threatening circle, but it was a powerful one, the kind of formation that carried both respect and gravity. The rancher's chest tightened. He had faced wild animals, harsh winters, and the endless demands of working the land, but nothing compared to this moment. He didn't know what was expected of him or why such a gathering had chosen to come here. All he knew was that something important was about to unfold. The rancher had always been a man who kept to himself. His life was built on quiet routines, rising before dawn, feeding the cattle, mending broken posts, watching the seasons turn over the years. He knew the land like the back of his hand, every ridge, every stream, every trail where a rider could disappear into the brush. His neighbors respected him for his work ethic, though most only saw him from a distance. He wasn't the type to join gatherings or seek out conversation. Yet, despite his quiet nature, people often felt he carried a kind of steadiness, the unspoken assurance that he could be counted on when times grew rough. But this was different. These weren't neighbors riding in from a nearby ranch. These were native warriors, strong and united, representing something older and deeper than the rancher had ever been a part of. Their faces showed the strength of tradition, and their eyes spoke of purpose. The elder he had saved must have carried the story back to them. And now the weight of that act was settling heavily on the rancher's shoulders. He shifted his stance, the brim of his hat shading his eyes, trying to read the moment, trying to understand. He thought back to that afternoon in the mountains. The image of the mountain lion still burned in his memory, the way its body had tensed before springing, the sharp glint in its eyes. He remembered the surge of instinct that had pushed him forward, the wild pounding of his horse's hooves as he charged. He hadn't thought of himself as brave in that moment. He had only thought of the elder, a man who had no chance to defend himself. To the cowboy, it was simple. You protect life, you stand between danger and the defenseless. That's the way he was raised. But maybe, to the community the elder belonged to, that choice carried a weight far greater than he realized. The warriors dismounted slowly, their boots hitting the ground with measured steps. Each movement was deliberate, as if guided by ceremony. The rancher's pulse quickened. He didn't know their language, not fully, but he could feel the message even without words: respect, unity, a kind of gratitude that went beyond handshakes or spoken thanks. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as they formed a line before him. Their leader, taller than the rest, stepped forward, his gaze steady and unreadable. The cowboy wondered if he should speak, but something in the leader's silence told him to wait. The air grew heavy with anticipation, the kind of tension that comes before a storm. He felt the weight of history pressing in, the meeting of two worlds, the solitary life of a rancher and the enduring traditions of a people who had lived on this land long before him. He realized then that his actions had not been small. They had bridged something much larger than himself. As the silence stretched on, the cowboy's thoughts drifted deeper. He remembered the stories his father had told him when he was a boy, tales of how ranchers and native communities once lived side by side, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. Those stories had always felt distant, like echoes from a past too far away to touch. But now, standing here surrounded by 50 warriors, those echoes were alive. The past was no longer just a story, it was standing in his yard, staring him down, demanding to be faced. The elder's face returned to his mind. He remembered the moment after the danger had passed, the way the old man had placed a hand gently on his arm. No words, just a touch, filled with more meaning than 100 sentences could carry. The cowboy hadn't known what it meant at the time, but now, seeing this gathering, he understood. That simple touch had been a passing of something sacred, a recognition that his actions would not be forgotten. The leader raised his hand, palm open, and the warriors followed, a wave of motion rippling through them. The gesture was powerful, but its meaning remained hidden from the cowboy. His heart thudded. Was this a sign of welcome, or was it a test? He clenched his jaw, steadying himself. Whatever this was, he would face it head on, just as he had faced the mountain lion. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, and the rancher felt time stretch thin. Every detail seemed sharper: the creak of leather, the snort of a horse, the rustle of wind through dry grass. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. The cowboy's mind raced with questions. Why had they come in such numbers? Why had they surrounded him in this way? Was this about honor alone, or was there more behind their presence? The air grew cooler as night crept in, but the tension only deepened. The rancher felt as though he stood at the edge of something greater than himself, a turning point that would decide not just his own story, but how two worlds might meet. He had lived his life by simple rules: hard work, honesty, courage when it was needed. Yet now, those rules seemed too small for the weight of what stood before him. The warriors did not speak, not yet. They held their silence with a discipline that unnerved him, their presence a wall of strength that seemed unshakable. The cowboy shifted his boots in the dust, feeling the ground solid beneath him. If this was to be a test, he would not falter. But inside, a quiet unease gnawed at him. He wasn't a man who sought out recognition, nor did he crave honor. He had acted because it was right, nothing more. And yet, somehow, that one act had drawn him into something larger, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the first stars began to prick the sky, the leader finally moved closer. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes carried a weight that made the rancher's breath catch. The cowboy braced himself, knowing that whatever came next would carry meaning that stretched far beyond this single evening. He didn't know if it would bring acceptance, challenge, or a burden he had not asked for. The circle of warriors tightened, their presence pressing closer, and the cowboy felt the land around him shift into silence. The moment had come, though. Its meaning remained hidden in shadows. All he knew was that life on his ranch would never return to the quiet rhythm it once held. Something had been set in motion, something he could not yet see. And there, under the vast sky of the west, the cowboy stood surrounded, waiting for the moment when silence would finally give way to words and when the true meaning of this gathering would at last be revealed. The leader of the warriors stood only a few steps away from the cowboy, his shadow long against the earth as the night finally closed in. For a moment, it seemed as if he might speak, but instead, he let the silence linger, deep and heavy. The cowboy felt his own breath echo in his ears, his heartbeat steady but hard. He knew something was building here, something he couldn't yet name. The leader finally lowered his hand, and the warriors followed. The gesture had been unified, purposeful, but its meaning was still hidden. The cowboy's mind turned in circles, trying to understand. He wasn't a man of ceremony. He lived by action, by doing what was right in the moment. But this gathering wasn't about mending fences or herding cattle. This was about tradition, honor, and something older than his own way of life, he thought. Again of the elder. There had been something in that man's eyes, even in the face of danger. A deep knowing, a kind of wisdom that came from a lifetime on the land. The way he had touched the cowboy's arm afterward, it hadn't been random. It was as though the elder had passed a responsibility to him, a burden he hadn't asked for. And now, seeing 50 warriors standing in his yard, the cowboy wondered if this was the weight of that moment finally being revealed. One of the younger warriors broke the silence, stepping forward with a glance at the leader. His voice was low, measured, but steady. The cowboy couldn't understand every word, but he caught enough to know the young man was speaking of the elder, the mountain, and the lion. His tone carried respect, but also something sharper, like warning. The cowboy's chest tightened. Was there anger here? Did they think he had stepped into something that wasn't his to interfere with? Or was this simply the gravity of a story being told in their way, a way that carried more meaning than any words he was used to? The leader raised a hand, and the younger warrior fell silent. The stillness returned, heavier than before. Then, slowly, the leader turned his eyes on the cowboy. It wasn't the look of an enemy, nor was it casual. It was a gaze that studied him, weighed him, measured his soul against something unseen. The cowboy held that gaze, refusing to look away. If this was a test, he would not fail it by showing. Fear dot, but inside, question stirred. Why had they come in such numbers? 50 warriors riding together was no small thing. Was it to honor? To challenge? To mark him as something he didn't understand? He could feel that this was bigger than gratitude alone. This was about connection, about boundaries, about what happens when one world collides with another. The rancher thought of his father again, of the old stories about lines drawn in the dirt, agreements made and broken, times when respect had been lost between ranchers and native people, and the long shadows those losses left behind. Could this gathering be about more than just the mountain lion? Could it be about healing something larger? Or was it a test to see if the cowboy could carry the weight of what he had stepped into without meaning to? His horse shifted nervously behind him, sensing the tension. The cowboy placed a steady hand on its neck, grounding himself as much as the animal. He looked at the warriors around him, their faces lit faintly by the rising moon. Each one was silent, disciplined, yet their presence spoke volumes. This was not a random gathering. This was deliberate, every rider chosen, every movement carrying meaning. The leader finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying the strength of someone who had spoken for many before him. The words were slow, almost like a rhythm, but the cowboy couldn't understand them fully. Still, he felt them. Each syllable was deliberate, heavy with history. And though he couldn't translate, he knew it was about him, about what had happened, about the elder who lived because of his choice. A chill moved through him as he realized he might never fully understand what was being asked of him here. But he also knew that turning away, refusing to face this moment, would be a mistake he could never take back. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to answer not with words, but with his presence, his steadiness. As the leader finished speaking, the younger warriors murmured among themselves, their tones mixed. Some sounded respectful, others sharper, as though not all agreed on what should come next. The cowboy caught fragments of looks, some filled with gratitude, others more cautious, even skeptical. He realized then that this was not a simple gathering of honor. This was also a gathering of decision. There were different voices among them, different views of who he was and what his actions meant, and suddenly he understood the heart of the conflict. To some, he had saved a life and deserved respect. To others, perhaps, he had crossed into something sacred, stepped into a place that was not his. The elder's safety was unquestioned, but the meaning behind it was not so simple. The cowboy's throat tightened. He had never wanted to be at the center of such questions. But here he was. The circle around him seemed to close in, not physically, but with the weight of their debate. He could feel the tension rising, the unspoken question, pressing against him from all sides. What would he do now? How would he carry the weight of this? The moon rose higher, throwing silver light across the land, and the cowboy knew this night was far from over. He was not just a rancher anymore, not just a man living quietly with his cattle and fences. He had become part of a story larger than himself, a story that carried both honor and danger. And whatever choice was waiting for him in the words of these warriors, it was a choice that would echo far beyond the walls of his ranch. He stood tall, his face steady, though his heart pounded. He didn't know yet whether he was being honored, judged, or tested. But he knew one thing. The story was only just beginning, and the tension that hung in the air would not break easily. Something was unfolding here that would change him, the warriors, and perhaps even the land itself. The air grew colder as the night deepened, the circle of warriors tightening around the cowboy until he felt the weight of 50 silent men pressing on him from every side. The leader's words still echoed in the air, heavy and deliberate, but unanswered. The younger riders shifted, some restless, others sharp-eyed, each carrying their own view of what should happen next. The cowboy could feel the divide among them, and it struck him like the cold wind off the mountains. This was not just about him anymore. This was about a decision, one that would ripple far beyond this ranch. The horses snorted and pawed at the dirt as if sensing the tension building between the men. The cowboy stood his ground, hat low, his hand brushing against the worn leather of his belt, not as a threat, but as a way to steady himself. He was no stranger to danger, but this was different. This wasn't about fighting a predator or braving a storm. This was about facing the weight of two worlds colliding in the stillness of a moonlit night. The leader's gaze did not waver. His presence was commanding, but not harsh. It was the younger warriors who carried the fire in their eyes. Their voices rose in sharp bursts of debate, their language carried with rhythm and force. Though the cowboy couldn't follow every word, he could read the tone, the urgency. Some defended him, their gestures pointing toward the mountains, their words carrying the elder's name like a shield. Others argued harder, their voices sharper, their eyes cutting toward the cowboy with suspicion. The cowboy's chest tightened as he realized the conflict was larger than gratitude or suspicion. To some, his actions might have marked him as a protector, someone worthy of honor. To others, perhaps he had stepped into a sacred test, a moment meant for the elder and the spirits of the land, not for an outsider. And by taking that moment into his own hands, he might have altered something far greater than he understood. The leader raised his hand again, and the voices fell quiet. The silence that followed was sharper than the arguments, filled with unspoken. "Wait." The leader took a slow step closer to the cowboy, their eyes locking once more. In that gaze, the cowboy felt the clash of history, the old wounds, the old bonds, the fragile line that still ran between his people and theirs. He held steady, though every muscle in his body was taut with anticipation. Then came a sound that made the hair on the back of his neck rise. From beyond the circle of warriors, carried on the wind, came the long, haunting cry of a coyote. It cut through the night, high and eerie, and the horses flicked their ears nervously. The warriors did not move, but the sound seemed to deepen. The moment, as if the land itself was listening, as if nature was waiting to see what choice would be made. The cowboy's mind raced. He thought again of the elder, of the quiet gratitude in his eyes, of the weight in that simple touch on his arm. He thought of his own father, who had taught him to respect the land and those who lived on it long before fences and cattle. And he thought of the danger he had faced, the mountain lion's eyes fixed on its prey, the surge of instinct that had driven him forward. He hadn't acted for glory, and he hadn't acted for thanks. He had acted because it was the only thing he could do. But was that enough to stand in this circle now, surrounded by 50 men who saw more in his actions than he ever had? The leader spoke again, his voice low and commanding. The younger warriors leaned in, listening closely, their faces tightening with intensity. Some nodded in agreement, others still looked doubtful, their hands twitching at their sides as if caught between respect and unease. The cowboy could feel the moment growing heavier, the tension thickening like storm clouds before lightning. He didn't need to know the words to understand what was happening. His fate and the meaning of his actions were being decided here and now. The circle closed in tighter. The sound of boots shifting in the dirt, the creak of leather, the snort of uneasy horses all blended into the rhythm of suspense. The cowboy's pulse thudded in his ears, his breath steady but shallow. Every instinct told him to be ready, though he still didn't know if he was preparing for honor or challenge, for acceptance or rejection. Then the leader lifted something. From his side a staff, carved and marked with symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. The warriors around him grew still, their eyes fixed on the object. The cowboy's heart jolted. This was no ordinary staff. This was a symbol, something sacred, something that carried meaning beyond words. The leader held it high, and the silence deepened. The cowboy's throat tightened. He didn't know if his staff was a sign of honor, a mark of challenge, or a burden being placed on him. But he knew it was everything. This was the moment the night had been building toward, the moment when the meaning of the gathering would finally be revealed. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of pine from the mountains, and the coyote cried again in the distance. The cowboy stood rooted in place, every nerve alive, every muscle coiled. The leader's eyes burned steady into his own, the staff raised high, the warriors waiting in silent unity. The weight of history, of respect, of suspicion, of unspoken bonds all hung in the balance. And then, just as the leader lowered the staff, the tension broke not with resolution, but with the sharp crack of a horse's hoof against stone, echoing like a gunshot in the still night. The circle jolted, the horses shifted, the younger warrior's hands moved instinctively, and the cowboy's breath caught in his chest. Everything was about to happen at once. Would the staff fall as a gift? Or as a judgment? Would the circle close in around him with honor or with fire? The cowboy didn't know. All he knew was that the moment had come, and whatever was about to unfold would change everything forever. The sharp crack of the horse's hoof echoed into the night like a spark in dry grass. For an instant, everything seemed on the edge of breaking, horses shifting nervously, younger warriors' hands twitching as if ready to act, the air thick with unease. The cowboy's breath caught in his chest, his body tense as a drawn rope. But then, slowly, the leader lowered the staff. The motion was deliberate, calm, and it seemed to draw the energy of the circle back into order. The younger men settled, their restless movements stilled by the presence of their leader's command. The staff touched the ground, steady and firm. And with that single gesture, the storm that threatened to break seemed to quiet. The leader stepped closer until he stood directly in front of the cowboy. His eyes searched the rancher's face with a depth that felt like it could see into his very bones. Then, with both hands, he extended the staff toward him. The cowboy's chest tightened, his breath caught again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the weight of realization. This wasn't a weapon being turned against him. It wasn't a threat. It was an offering. For a moment, the cowboy hesitated. He wasn't a man who sought symbols or honors. He was a man of simple work, of saddle, and rope, of earth and sky. But he could feel the gravity in this moment. To refuse would be to turn away from everything this gathering meant. So with steady hands, he reached out and placed his fingers on the carved wood. The staff was heavy, but it carried more than weight. It carried history. It carried gratitude. It carried responsibility. The leader gave a single nod, his expression unreadable but firm. Then he stepped back, and the circle of warriors shifted. A murmur rose among them, not sharp now, but low and unified, like the hum of a distant drum. The sound filled the air, rising and falling in rhythm, carrying the story of what had happened in the mountains and what was happening now. The cowboy didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. He felt them in his chest, like the beating of his own heart. The younger warriors who had looked doubtful before now studied him with new eyes. Some still carried questions in their gaze, but the tension of suspicion had softened. They could see he had not turned away from the moment. He had accepted the staff, not with pride, but with respect. And in that respect, something shifted. The circle was no longer one of judgment. It had become one of unity. The cowboy thought back again to the elder. He remembered the man's quiet steps on the trail, the shadow of danger looming above him, and the fragile weight of a life in those seconds before the lion sprang. He remembered the way the elder's hand had touched his arm afterward, the unspoken bond formed in that moment. And now, standing here with the staff in his grip, he understood. This was the continuation of that bond. This was the elder's gratitude given form through his people. The warriors' voices grew louder, filling the night, then slowly faded until silence returned once more. The leader gave another nod, this time toward the cowboy's land, toward the ranch that stood behind him. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, as if to say, this place, this man, this night, it all mattered. Then, one by one, the warriors mounted their horses again. Their movements were fluid, disciplined, their unity unbroken even as they prepared to ride away. The cowboy stood with the staff still in his hand, watching as the circle shifted into a line. 50 riders turned their horses toward the open land, their silhouettes dark against the rising moon. As they rode, they moved as one, their presence fading into the distance until only the sound of hooves remained, echoing across the hills. The cowboy stayed still, the staff firm in his grip, his heart still racing with everything that had just unfolded. When the last rider disappeared into the night, the land seemed to exhale. The air grew quiet again, the stars bright overhead. The only sound the distant cry of a coyote once more. But now, that cry no longer carried unease. It felt like a witness, a reminder that the land itself had been part of this story. The cowboy lowered the staff and let it rest against the ground, his hand brushing the carvings etched deep into the wood. Each line, each mark, spoke of generations, of lives lived with honor and respect. He had not earned this symbol through words or ceremony, but through a single act of courage, a choice to protect another life without thought of himself. He walked slowly back to his barn, his boots crunching against the dirt, the weight of the staff heavy but steady at his side. Inside, his horse shifted, still restless from the nights. Energy. He stroked its neck, whispering a quiet reassurance. The animal calmed, as if it too understood that the storm had passed. The cowboy leaned against the barn wall, looking out at the wide-open land. He thought of how he had always lived. Quietly, unseen by most, his days marked only by work and routine. But this night had shown him something greater, that even the simplest life can cross paths with history, that even one act of courage can carry meaning beyond anything you expect. He hadn't asked for honor, but it had found him. And with it came a reminder that every life, no matter how solitary, is part of something larger. The days that followed carried whispers. Stories spread across the nearby towns, told in quiet voices around campfires and gatherings. They spoke of the night when 50 warriors rode to a ranch not to fight, but to honor. They spoke of the cowboy who saved an elder from a mountain lion and of the staff given to him under the moon. The story grew, carried far beyond the hills, reminding people of courage, respect, and the power of standing for what is right. The cowboy never sought to correct the stories or add his own voice. He continued his work, rising before dawn, tending his cattle, mending fences, living in the rhythm he always had. But the staff remained with him, placed in a corner of his cabin where the firelight touched its carvings each night. It was a reminder not only of what he had done, but of the bond formed in that moment. A bond that connected him to something deeper than himself. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, he would think of the elder. He would picture him walking the trail again, steady but slow, and he would feel a quiet satisfaction that the man still lived to see another day. Other times, he would think of the warriors, their circle in the dust, their voices rising like the rhythm of the land itself. And he would remember the leader's gaze, steady and unshakable, as he placed the staff into his hands. The land carried on as it always had. The seasons turned, the herds grazed, storms rolled across the sky. But for the cowboy, nothing was quite the same. He had seen what honor looked like, not written in books or spoken in speeches, but lived in silence, in unity, in a circle of riders under the stars. He had learned that courage doesn't end when the danger passes. It carries forward, shaping the way people see you, the way stories are told, the way respect is earned. And though he would never call himself a hero, the cowboy knew the truth of what had happened. He had been a man who did what needed to be done, and for that, he had been surrounded, honored, and forever remembered. As he looked out at the endless sky, he felt a quiet peace. The land was wide, the world was harsh, but there was meaning in every step, every choice, every act of courage. That night, with the staff glowing faintly in the firelight, the cowboy let the silence of the West settle around him. The story was no longer just his. It belonged to the land, to the elder, to the warriors, to all who would remember. And in that, he found his place not as a man seeking recognition, but as a man who had lived by his code and discovered the power of respect that endures long after the dust has settled.